May 18, 1945. The woman clutches her mouth, eyes wide in horror, as she stares at the bloodied corpse. It's just one of many scattered across the field, victims of the Nuremberg death march. Behind her, Allied troops watch in silence. They've forced the nearby German villagers to witness the horrors their regime left behind. This was part of denazification, the Allies' sweeping campaign from 1945 to 1952 to purge Germany of Nazism. Some methods were harsh, others extreme. But one question remains: how did Germany get rid of the Nazis so fast? Following Germany's surrender after the death of Adolf Hitler in the Führer bunker, much of Germany was in ruins. Allied bombing runs and the relentless westward advance of the Red Army had brought the worst of the fighting to Germany's doorstep. The head of the snake that was the German government and its war machine were gone, and now the Allies had to share the responsibility of moving Germany forward. At the 1945 Yalta Conference between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, an agreement was made for the responsibility of denazification to be shared between their powers. According to the Potsdam Declaration, they declared their intent, quote, "All members of the Nazi Party who have been more than nominal participants are to be removed from public or semi-public office and from positions of responsibility and important private undertakings." The Allies had learned from their mistakes after World War I. Under the Treaty of Versailles and other related sanctions, Germany as a nation had been crippled as a punishment for its indiscretions. The Central Powers, the coalition forces headed by the German Empire, were made to pay 132 billion gold marks in reparations, around $600 billion in today's money. The country was broken, impoverished, and humiliated, which was the very cocktail of desperation, resentment, and frustration that rolled out the red carpet for the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. It let them harness the discontent of the people through the plays toward nostalgia for an imagined past, extreme nationalism, and scapegoating of minorities, though particularly the Jewish people. To keep history from repeating itself, the Allies knew that they had to go deeper than just defeating an army. They had to tear Nazism out by the roots. If they didn't, it could start growing again the second it was left unattended. The first step in this process was splitting Germany apart into 4 occupied zones: Northwest Germany, controlled by Britain; Southwest Germany, controlled by France; Southeast Germany, controlled by the United States; and Northeast Germany, controlled by the Soviet Union. And seeing as each of these nations had very different perspectives on the best methods for burning out the Nazi scourge, while of course benefiting themselves, Germany became a kind of experimental petri dish for denazification methods. The first step across basically all of these segments was a series of automatic arrests. Active Nazi devotees in positions of power, such as police, civil servants, and of course SS members, were fired from their jobs and taken to Allied internment camps without trial. 400,000 Germans ended up being taken to these camps in the 5-year period between 1945 and 1950, with the lion's share of those being taken by the Soviets. And that's because the Soviets running the northeast of Germany weren't just arresting Nazis. They were also locking up their other political opponents in the region who might act as a roadblock to later Soviet influence in the area. The camps for these non-Nazi political opponents were called special camps, because the Soviets weren't really great at euphemisms. As the second sweeping move made by the Allied powers, the Nazi Party was banned. Anyone who was caught advocating the ideas of the Nazi Party would be sentenced to death. But there was so much more to denazifying Germany than just putting the most obvious Nazis in internment camps and threatening the official structure of the party. Hitler's party had been in power for 12 years, and his ideology and symbols had been weaving their way through German culture for years before that. And seeing as the Nazis were utterly obsessed with branding, they had put their signs and symbols all across the country. So the first step, and one of the things that has remained a facet of German law to this day, was completely outlawing the use of the swastika in public life. But that was just the beginning. The US Army took the reins of the German media. Suddenly, 37 German newspapers and 6 radio stations. They also controlled 314 theaters, 642 cinemas, 101 magazines, and 237 book publishers. And on top of that, almost 7,400 book dealers and printers were under their command. With this massive propaganda machine under its control, the US Army wanted to distribute pro-democracy, pro-US, and anti-Nazi material. They hoped to start pushing back on the years of Nazi media that had been reshaping German minds. Ironically, in order to pursue their vision of complete denazification, the US Army employed some Nazi tactics. Most infamously, they made a list of thousands of book titles that were deemed an ideological threat, advancing Nazi views throughout the nation. These books were confiscated and destroyed, not unlike the Nazi book burnings, a comparison that even the military directorate of the US admitted did have some grounds. However, in the defense of the US, the books weren't burned in a big public ceremony, they were quietly purged in large factories instead. But it didn't stop there. The US didn't want the Nazi ideology being memorialized, concerned that it could lead to a revival of old habits. So they mandated that any museums devoted to Nazi ideas or soldiers be liquidated, and their exhibits either taken or destroyed. The same was true for any artworks that were seen to lionize or support Nazi ideals. This meant that in all likelihood a lot of paintings of Hitler dressed like a Teutonic knight ended up inside American military warehouses. There were also severe limitations placed on the kind of art people could make in this new Germany too. The Allied forces also got to work on some serious redecorating. Swastikas were everywhere, etched into buildings, stamped into official documents, hanging from flags and banners on nearly every street. It was a complicated job to travel through the entire country, removing symbols and flags anywhere they found them. All of this in an effort to remove the physical traces of the Nazis, who had put so much effort to remake Germany in their own image. But even this paled in comparison to their next task. They needed to remove any trace of Nazi support from the minds of the German populace. This involved an extremely sophisticated and often harrowing psychological warfare operation against the people of Germany. The Allies wanted to create a powerful sense of collective responsibility and collective guilt in the minds of the German public. The idea was to prevent everyday Germans from emotionally or morally distancing themselves from the Nazis' most horrific crimes. In the words of Sidney Bernstein, chief of Psychological Warfare Division, the intention was to, quote, shake and humiliate the Germans and prove to them beyond any possible challenge that these crimes against humanity were committed and that the German people, and not just the Nazis and SS, bore responsibility. One way of doing this was the use of propaganda posters and pamphlets, distributed all over Germany by the United States forces. The most famous of these was a poster depicting the corpses of concentration camp victims, dominated by a large headline text that read, Diese Schandtaten, eure Schuld, which is German for These Atrocities, Your Fault. Another one of these stunts was reported in a small German town by the English writer James Stern, who said, a crowd is gathered around a series of photographs which, though initially seeming to depict garbage, instead reveal dead human bodies. Each photograph has a heading, Who is guilty? The placards are later replaced with clearer photographs and placards proclaiming, This town is guilty. You are guilty. But the posters depicting the most brutal crimes of the Nazi regime were still on the more mild end of US tactics in inducing a sense of collective guilt. For towns and villages closer to liberated concentration camps, the whole community would sometimes be taken out to the camps and made to see the bodies of their government's victims. In some cases, they were even given shovels and made to help in digging up the mass graves where these people had been so thoughtlessly buried. And for those who lived further away, the US government sometimes carted truckloads of corpses into town for public demonstrations, showing the people the inevitable end of these kinds of fascist regimes. Wehrmacht soldiers and civilians were also made to sit in on the screenings where footage of concentration camp atrocities were played. Many of the viewers broke down in tears under the weight of this terrible knowledge. None could ever hide from the awful things the Nazis had done. All of these methods were vital in quickly clearing out the visual evidence of the Nazi plague in Germany and turning a lot of the public against them and their crimes. But what about the actual legal consequences for the people who really did directly contribute to the Nazis and their machine of evil? That, as it turns out, was its own other extremely complicated matter for the Allied forces. From November 20th, 1945 to October 1st, 1946, the world watched history unfold at the Nuremberg trials. 24 of the highest-ranking Nazis captured by the Allies, including Karl Donitz, Wilhelm Frick, and Hermann Göring, were tried for their actions under the Nazi regime. Many were executed or given heavy prison sentences, but there was so much more to the Nazi apparatus than just the men on the very top rungs. By the time the war was over, around 8.5 million Germans, 10% of the population, were members of the Nazi Party. But there were even more people involved in Nazi-adjacent political groups. For example, there were 32 million people in the German Labor Front, 17 million in the National Socialist People's Welfare, and even 2 million in the National Socialist Women's League. All in all, around 45 million people were in the party and party-affiliated groups that made up the German government. A rubric needed to be created for the lower-level Germans investigated for their complicity in the crimes of the Nazi Party. So by the end of the Nuremberg trials, the Allied Control Council announced Directive 24, or Law 104 for Liberation from National Socialism and Militarism, which outlined some legal parameters and consequences shared roughly across all the sectors. This led to 5 categories that all these millions of lower-level suspects would be placed into, each one of them with a fixed severity of punishment. Those without meaningful Nazi ties were dubbed exonerated individuals and released without punishment. Nazi followers and supporters were given a fine and surveilled afterward to ensure they didn't fall back into their old ways. Lesser offenders were given probation up to 3 years. Activists, militarists, and profiteers could see up to a decade in prison, and major offenders could be sentenced to life imprisonment or even execution. But who would run all those systems, which would involve endless investigations, questionnaires, and tribunals, especially given that the Allies had their own countries and empires to run, as well as growing Cold War tensions that would tear the alliance apart from within? The solution was to hand over the denazification process to the German government itself, a new, interstitial ruling body made out of German resistance fighters, union bosses, and judges that had been vetted by the Allies for reliability. These internal tribunals became known as Spruchkammer. It seemed like a good idea in theory, but problems quickly arose. Since it was nearly impossible to bring everyone into a physical courtroom, the judgments were made on the basis of extensive questionnaires known as Fragebogen. It contained 131 questions that probed applicants on everything from their lifestyle to their political history, along with key documents that could prove the reality of what they were saying. But we're talking about the pre-digital era here, so records were hard to come by, and perjury was rife. A lot of the time, the tribunals needed to rely on written statements from people's friends and neighbors, most of which exonerated them. As a result of this, only 1.4% of the people investigated were convicted as major offenders, and those were the ones that were so obviously guilty or just too bad at lying to slip through the cracks. The grand majority were written off as mere followers who were slapped with a small fine and sent on their way like nothing ever happened. There was even a dark joke that the certificates handed out were Persil, a popular cleaning detergent, because they whitewashed the reputations of the people who had committed some truly heinous crimes. The specifics for how those denazifying hunts took place varied from zone to zone. In the American-controlled territory, anyone who had ever been an active Nazi was kicked from their government position. This seems like a very good thing, but given that it was hard to be part of the government if you didn't at least pretend to show enthusiasm for the party, it left the administrative structure of Southeast Germany a shadow of its former self. This made the process in this sector a lot slower than its neighbors. There was also a strong focus on promoting the virtues of democracy. The goal was to re-educate the German people, to pull them out of the fascist mindset that years of Nazi brainwashing had instilled. At the same time, the Allies wanted to position the public against the rising tide of communism, which was spreading from the east. Of course, this was a lot easier said than done. The British-controlled zone was less focused on political cleansing and instead focused on German administrative efficiency and building back up the economy. But orders were sometimes contradictory, and the process was complicated and slow. Get used to hearing that. The French-controlled section wasn't quite as rigid and was more focused on French national interest. Given that France had undergone some real horrors during Nazi occupation, they wanted to get Nazis out of civil service and into key industry positions, seeing as the Americans were taking care of the political purchase. They also wanted Germany disarmed and deindustrialized, so the war machine that had devastated their country couldn't just start back up. The Soviets had a much more organized and united front in their sector, but again, it was done as much for their own gain as for the betterment of Germany. In the Western Allied sectors, the post-Nazi government was stacked with people across the political spectrum. But in the Soviet sector, the preferential treatment was given to the KPD, or Communist Party of Germany, who would later become the Socialist Unity Party. It was the Soviet plan for Germany to become a communist corridor that would give them greater influence over the West in the power vacuum left by the Nazis. They were also eager to rebuild their own territory, which had been devastated by the failed Nazi invasion. As part of this effort, they took heavy financial reparations and took resources from their struggling sector back to the motherland too. In Berlin, the nation's capital co-ruled by all of the Allied powers, there were more political purges. Anyone who wanted to get into Berlin's politics needed to pass the denazification smell test of the Allied Kommandatura, made up of members of the British, French, American, and Soviet governments. But the looming specter of the Cold War would be the force that slowly warped and destroyed the pure intentions of denazification. The East and the West became less interested in reforming Germany and more eager to recruit the new Germany into their cause, solidifying power in Western Europe. And the best way to secure German loyalty was changing tactics, accepting rather than punishing the Nazis and Nazi sympathizers that still remained. Most of the Nazis who went down for their crimes in the denazifying process were the ones who weren't useful to the Allied forces. As Cold War paranoia drove a wedge between the Americans and the Soviets, both sides decided it would be beneficial to pick apart the Nazi carcass and take the elements that would give them an edge over their enemies. On the American side, there was Operation Paperclip. This was a clandestine effort to bring over the best of the Reich's exceptional minds to aid in their own science projects, though particularly military research and development and contributions to the space race. Among the many scientists given a place in the US and a clean record was Wernher von Braun, the father of the Nazi V-2 rocket. He was given a vital role to play in America's journey to the moon. This was despite substantial evidence that Braun had taken advantage of concentration camp slave labor in his research. Soon, the tribunals became more and more lenient on even the most egregious of the so-called small Nazis left in Germany. The Allies also approved amnesty packages with increasing frequency, making it clear to all that the wind was changing on denazification. And by February 1948, the Soviets were the first ones to officially say that they would be ending their denazification procedures. And it wouldn't take long for the Western powers to do the same. After all, they didn't want Russia to take advantage of this new, softer stance on Nazism before they could. The American government widely considered communism to now be a greater threat to their interests than Nazism, and any denazification responsibilities were passed back over to the German authorities, who at this point were mostly just eager to put the whole thing to bed. And by May 11, 1951, they did. The newly formed Federal Republic of Germany passed the new Federal Law 131. This allowed anyone fired under the follower or lesser offender brackets in 1945 to return to their government jobs. And on October 6, 1952, the rights of individuals who had previously been removed from public life due to their affiliations with the Nazi Party or the Wehrmacht were officially reinstated. From that point on, it became illegal to discriminate against someone based on those factors. The German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, the Soviet puppet side of the country east of the Berlin Wall, also considered its Nazis rehabilitated. The Federal Republic of Germany, a democracy, would be run by its new chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, who opposed denazification out of fear that it would delay his country's rearmament against its new communist neighbor. East Germany was ruled by the Socialist Unity Party, with Wilhelm Pieck as its president. Everyone wanted to move forward, not back. Within 7 years, the world had witnessed the birth, life, and death of denazification. The swastikas and Nazi literature were all gone, and the party itself was no more. But there was no longer any legal basis to punish the people who had been a part of that machinery. Many in the arts and in private industry were able to make it through the cracks, and with the restrictions lifted on former Nazi affiliates holding public office, many government departments were being staffed by the same people who had served under the Nazi regime. But how did Germany get rid of the Nazis so fast? Well, the answer is, it didn't. Hitler and his inner circle may have met their end during the war or at the hangman's noose after the Nuremberg trials, and many hearts and minds in Germany were changed by the shock of what had been done in their name. But due to the massive administrative stresses of denazification and the pressures of the incoming Cold War, the job was rushed. Many monstrous people slipped through the cracks only to reappear in Argentina, but not for the reasons you'd expect. Watch the real reason why Nazi officers fled to Argentina after World War II to find out why.